The opioid crisis has resulted in the deaths of over 200,000 people in the U.S., while the Sackler family, the owners of the company that makes OxyContin, have made billions. David Sackler is a third-generation member of the family and spoke to Vanity Fair about the issue back in June. He defended his family's actions.
Here to discuss all of this is the reporter and author of that piece, Bethany McClean. She's a contributing editor at Vanity Fair and joins us now. This is such an important piece that you reported out, Bethany, because the Sacklers don't talk a lot. They're very elusive. They're very reclusive. And I want to just read to our viewers a quote that David Sackler gave you. He says, "We didn't cause the crisis." So who does he say is responsible?
That's a very interesting question, actually, because he never directly answered that. I think he would say that. I think he would say that a whole bunch of people are responsible for the crisis, including the changing standards of medicine, other companies and their actions, and perhaps even the FDA. And I don't disagree with him on that. I think the Sacklers played a role in the crisis, but I don't think they were the sole cause of it.
Well, the truth of the matter is that opioids were available before OxyContin. They weren't used as widespread precisely because physicians felt that they were addictive. And it was Purdue Pharma that developed this new delivery mechanism, if you will, right, that they said would be less addictive. And there was a definite sort of marked difference between the amount of opioids being prescribed sort of before and after the existence of OxyContin. So if he says the Sacklers aren't responsible, you know, that's fine. But how does he sort of explain what you got to say is sort of an outsized influence that Purdue Pharma had on the ramping up of the number of prescriptions for opioids being put out there?
Absolutely. I think what David Sackler would say is that the science changed. The FDA signed off on the ways in which OxyContin was marketed, and that's actually true. The FDA allowed them to say that there was a small chance of addiction, and that this extended release formula that they came up with probably meant that it would be less addictive than the old ways of delivering opioids. That turned out to be completely the opposite. And what David would say is that as the science changed, we changed. I don't agree with him here, because the marketing of OxyContin was unprecedented in terms of how they just flooded the market with advertisements and with money spent on getting doctors to do this and paying doctors to produce research that said this stuff wasn't addictive. And all of this was done without any real study that said this isn't addictive. And you can say our government and its flawed process of approving drugs and allowing companies to market to consumers and market to doctors and sway the science the way we did, the way they did is part of the problem. That's true, but I don't think it excuses the actions or the irresponsibility in flooding the market with highly addictive drugs in the absence of any real science that said people aren't going to get addicted.
And also, Bethany, I'm curious, because pretty early on, it became evident that people were abusing it, that people were crushing the pills to sort of circumvent the delivery mechanism that was supposed to slow the absorption of the drug. Doctors knew about it. Presumably, Purdue Pharma knew about it. Does he explain why it took so long for them to revamp the pill so that it wasn't susceptible to abuse?
Right. Well, I think here I have some sympathy for David in this, and for the Sacklers in this. And what I mean by that is that there were reports that people were abusing it. When do you, as a manufacturer of a product that can be abused, say reports of abuse are rising to a level that we have to do something serious about this, that there's a problem with our product? This isn't just isolated. And I think it's very easy in hindsight to judge them and say they should have done more immediately. I wouldn't want to put myself in their shoes and to have had to have made that decision at the time. That said, I'm offering an explanation for what they did rather than an excuse. Of course, they had a profit motive as well, right? They were standing to make billions of dollars from this drug, and I'm sure that of course influenced the decisions that they made. But nonetheless, I wouldn't have wanted to be in their shoes trying to make that decision with a bunch of reports coming in around the country saying people are abusing this. This isn't working out as we said. said, when do you say my new beautiful miracle drug that's going to make me a fortune and fix America's pain isn't what I thought it was? How do you make that call?
You know, what's really fascinating about your interview with him, Bethany, is that in many instances he's very defensive. And you do point out that Purdue Pharma was only responsible for about 4% of all of the opioids that were marketed out there in the United States. On the other hand, there are two things that I learned that were really interesting in your story. One is that as they produced that new pill that was not able to be broken up and snorted, as the generic version was coming onto the market, they went out there and told people, no, you shouldn't do the generic version because it's really, really addictive. And that's why we're doing this new pill. So they knew that the older form of OxyContin was highly addictive. And the other thing that I learned, which was really interesting, is the FDA and their role in this, because he's pointing to the FDA. He's pointing to doctors and saying, you know, they also had a role in getting Americans addicted. And yet the FDA, as you point out in your piece here, is influenced by corporate money. The FDA, the consensus that the FDA usually gleans its information from is purchased so often, I'm quoting your piece here, is purchased so often and in such insidious ways that trust is impossible. This is the Federal Drug Administration.
Right. And I think you make two really good points here. Yes, Purdue did invest a lot of money in coming up with this anti-tamper form of OxyContin, but people question their motives and are cynical about it because at the same time as they rolled it out, they said, and by the way, don't use this other form because it's really addictive. And so it was also a means of protecting their market share and protecting their profits. It was both things at the same time. And yes, David and the Sacklers look to the FDA and say the FDA approved all this, and the FDA did. That's actually true. And doctors did produce research. Purdue enlisted plenty of doctors to say opioids are the miracle drug and they won't cause addiction. But all of this involved money. It was science that was bought and paid for. And in fairness to the Sacklers and Purdue, that's the way the American system works. They weren't unique in taking advantage of that, far from it. But when you step back and look at it, at the devastation that it caused in this case, it's hard not to think that there's something incredibly corrupt about the entire system.
So let me just ask this question then. David Sackler, you talk in your piece a lot about the origins of the prescription of pain medication for pain that is beyond cancer. In other words, there was a moment in this country where doctors prescribed these really, really potent drugs to people who were suffering from terminal disease and terminal illnesses.
Palliative care, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it became, well, no, you can actually treat pain, you know, from an injury, a sports injury, for example, or a back injury with some of these very powerful drugs. Is there a moment that he explains to you or through your research that you understand that someone at Purdue Pharma realized that this was happening, they realized that they could capitalize on Americans' desire.
Almost the industry of pain, really.
The industry of pain,
Yeah.
that's a great way to say it.
I think they realized it right away. I think David's father, Richard Sackler, who drove this, realized right away that there was this huge market in treating all this pain that people are in that was going untreated. And look, there's something, I'm not going to, altruistic isn't quite the right word, but there's something about helping other people in that. If you really can come up with a magic pill that's going to help people with their pain, what a wonderful thing. And doctors wanted to believe it because it's a whole lot easier to be able to give a patient in terrible pain a pill and say, I fixed your problem. You get to be doctor as God, right? Instead of doctor who says, well, you're going to have to learn some breathing techniques and this is going to suck sometimes. And I mean, it was the proverbial silver bullet, right? That appeared to solve everything. And of course there was a profit motive in it, but I actually believe that Richard Sackler really thought he'd come up with this marvelous new way to solve this problem of untreated pain. And it just happened to tap into a moment in our culture where everybody was starting to worry about this, where pain was becoming this thing that had to be treated. And of course, some of that changing attitude was influenced by Purdue money as well. One of the big moments doctors all point to is this moment where the Joint Commission, which sets all the standards for hospitals, said that started to measure doctors on how well pain was treated. And for hospitals, the Joint Commission wields an incredible amount of power because if they give you a bad score, you get denied reimbursement. endorsements, everything falls apart. And so that moment when the Joint Commission started saying that patients were going to score their doctors and their hospitals on how well the pain was being treated was this moment where the prescription opioids just got unleashed on America. And Purdue money was involved. Purdue gave money to the Joint Commission. So it's all, I really tried, one of the things I wanted to do in this piece was kind of untangle the roots of it and figure out what came from Purdue's money and Purdue's science and what movements about pain were growing up separately. And I came to the conclusion it was just impossible to untangle. It's like the roots of a banyan tree, right? Just too tangled to possibly figure out which was which.
Yeah, I think this is a really important story to tell because it points to the fact that though the Sacklers have become sort of the poster child for using their money to influence science and then sort of using their money to influence the arts with all these donations to kind of cover up what could be a bad name, right? They're really just a small part of a much bigger system. You point out only 4% of the opioids out there are what they were able to provide. There are many other companies that were also providing opioids and feeding this addiction, and like you point out, it's a top-down problem from the government all the way down to the companies and the doctors.
And I'll just leave this is how David Sackler wants people to think of his family and of Purdue Pharma. He says he believes that the company, Purdue Pharma, his family's company, should be applauded for its efforts to address the opioid epidemic and not castigating for helping to create it. So I guess the question will be put to the American people and to all of those state attorney generals who are now going after the company. Bethany McClean, if our audience wants to check out your piece on Vanity Fair, it's really, really good, really in-depth reporting, really great interview. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.